So, as James Hay mentioned, Jim Carey hired me because I was a historian, and it was an unconventional hire. I guess you could say he hired me on a whim, because in addition to being out of field, I also had no significant teaching experience and no real publication record. So it was an act of faith on Jim's part. And it worked out for me. I can't say about how it worked out for anyone else. But so when he made me the author, I asked him what I should read to get into the field. And now in the essay Linda was talking about, Jim begins by saying, when I started the serious study of communication, I asked a wise man what I should read. And he said, and that was Jay Jensen, the wise man. He said, start with John Dewey. So when I asked Jim, he said, start with Walter Lippmann. And I wish he'd have said John Dewey. But I came to realize as I worked through Lippmann over the years, that the Lippmann-Dewey debate was absolutely central to Jim's thinking about everything. And now it's fashionable among some people, Sue Curry Jansen, Michael Schutzen, to claim that the Lippmann-Dewey debate never existed. And Lana Rackow has responded to that effectively. I won't get into that unless someone else wants to. But in Jim's reading, Lippmann and Dewey proposed two different visions of citizenship that centered around a similar diagnosis of democracy in peril. And the diagnosis of democracy in peril, fit into each of Jim's several histories. The history of the field that Linda talks about, the history of journalism, in which conversation as a model continually lost ground to expertise and professionalism. The history of technology, in which spatial biases replaced temporal biases, transmission replaced ritual. The history of the public sphere, in which appeals to interest in face-to-face settings, appeals to interest in mass-mediated settings, replace rational critical discourse in town meetings and in newspapers.
Lippmann's public opinion, with its critique of the, I'm split between two screens now. I feel that. Okay. With its critique of the myth of the omnicompetent citizen and its deconstruction of the formation of political culture, offered an account of modernity that promised an endless purgatory. Carey's own history sought redemption. I'm working in the Catholic thing here. Something that Jim and I had in common. Although Carey adopted some of Lippmann's critique of the modern media system, he rebelled against Lippmann's realist resignation and proposed instead resistance in the form of public journalism, convivial technology, most particularly the university tradition. And that essay of his plea for the university tradition is something I'll come back to in a minute. His histories aimed for happy endings, but the happy endings were always beyond the horizon. And I think that's one explanation for why he never finished any of the book manuscripts he was working on. He'd get to 100 pages and then he'd say, well, I'm kind of losing interest, and he'd start on another one. Another thing I should point out here is that all of Jim's histories were histories of ideas, and they were meant to show that ideas matter. His ideas, the ideas that shape the field, the ideas that are in journalism, always moving toward a history of ideas. And part of this, I think, came from his grad school era allergy to Marxists on the faculty, which he spoke about in some of his final interviews with almost embarrassing frankness, almost embarrassing. Carey always considered himself an outsider, and he always took a contrarian stance. And Illinois was suited for that position, I think. He saw himself in Illinois on the margins, outside looking in, not at a media capital, but nevertheless at what he believed to be the center of the universe in other ways. The transportation capital, the birthplace of the skyscraper, the center of the flow of commodities, where futures were invented, that sort of thing. All of his signature work, all of his most cited work came out of the Illinois years. The book Communication as Culture, a cultural approach to communication, Technology and Ideology, the case of the telegraph, the communications revolution and the professional communicator, the problem of journalism history, Harold Adams Innes and Marshall McLuhan, the mythos of the electronic revolution. All of it was Illinois inspired, Illinois themed. Columbia may claim him, and he did abandon us for Columbia, but at that point, I think he had already established his identity. It's an Illinois identity. His outsider status he clung to, but it was mythical and transitory. He moved to the center of the field. He often told stories of his early humiliations. Maybe that was just with me. I don't know. Did he do that with you? But did he? I'll tell you some of them later. Of course, I had humiliation stories too, so it was not a one-way street. Anyway, he certainly had his vindication. He spoke of the many rejections he received from Journalism Quarterly, for instance, but pointed out that they had to publish his presidential address to the Association for Education and Journalism. And that's the essay, A Plea for the University Tradition, which I mentioned earlier. Some outsiders. He professed modesty about his essay, The Problem of Journalism History. He once told me that, so it was part of one of these longer works that he was working on, right? And he said, well, they asked me for an essay, and I figured I could send them 11 pages with one stamp. So I took the first 11 pages and mailed it off. And what's crazy about that is it can't be true, because the essay has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's not just random 11 pages. He didn't do his own mailing. He would have had a secretary do. Juanita Craven may have done the mailing. I don't know. And the way he would write at the time was in longhand and then handed to a secretary to type up. So he had to have made up this story. But he makes up this story to sort of undermine the mystique that surrounds this now scriptural essay among journalism historians. Again, the sort of positioning on the margin of another enterprise. His migration from Illinois to New York stunned all of us here in the prairie. It was an abandonment of the land grant system that he had bragged about annually at the orientation. It was also a capitulation to the professional model of journalism education that he had critiqued in The Plea for the University Tradition. There is no more professionalized J school than Columbia's, I would say. But then he began to spin equally captivating myths about Columbia. He would talk about the craft mastery of his professional colleagues, how efficiently they would edit their students' stories, for instance, how broadly educated they were. He would talk about the Ivy League and the intricacies of the subterranean conflict between WASPs and Jews that he saw there. He thought it was as fascinating as Chicago politics, which it may well have been. I don't know. He was tickled to be in New York City, where the media sphere is centered. And in the ultimate betrayal, he grew up a Red Sox fan. He became a Cubs fan. And Steve, if you're listening, you know that's a bit of a conversion. I'm a Reds fan. I don't like the Cubs. But then he became a Yankees fan. He would go to Yankee Stadium. I watched the deciding game of the '96 World Series with him, and I couldn't believe it. He was rooting for the Yankees. Well, can there be any more primal betrayal? The scholarly vision remained unimpaired. The grand narratives were not deranged by internet utopianism at the turn of the century, which seduced many of those in our field. And he remained committed to a project of reviving citizenship and community and ritual. My final engagement with Jim was when Angie Valdivia suggested we get him to do an audiobook. So we flew him out from New York, and he spent a couple of days, talked to the pro sound, and we got him in a studio and we had him do a demo. So I have a couple of CDs with passages from some of his late essays. The next thing he needed to do was a table of contents. He put together the table of contents, press would take it, get the necessary permissions, and then he could spend a couple of days reading his book. And it would have been beautiful, because anyone who dealt with him knows that his voice was irreplaceable. You would be captivated listening to him read the phone book, literally. And what we have traces of that book on CDs and my bookshelves, but the project died with him. His voice lives on in our memory. Thanks.